The year was 1936. You hear that baby crying? That's Buddy Holly. He's just been born in the town of Lubbock, Texas. His parents named him Charles Hardin Holly, but he didn't like that, so he changed it to just regular old Buddy. In 1956, he recorded the song you're listening to now, That'll Be the Day, with his band, The Crickets. They were huge. People loved them. They played the Apollo. In 1959, Buddy Holly got on an airplane to fly to the Winter Dance Party in Iowa, where he was scheduled to perform. He had no way of knowing it at the time, but he would never make it to the show. The weather was bad, and visibility was poor. Just after takeoff, the plane fell out of the sky and crashed into a cornfield. Everyone on board died instantaneously, including Buddy Holly and fellow musicians Ritchie Valens and the Big Fat Bopper. In 1971, Don McLean III wrote a song about it called The Day the Music Died.
I can't remember if I cried when I read about his widowed bride.
7 years later, in 1978, Gary Busey played the role of Buddy Holly in the film The Buddy Holly Story.
The music died.
A decade later, in 1988, Busey was severely injured in a motorcycle accident in which he was not wearing a helmet. He cracked his skull and suffered permanent brain damage. The following year, a monument was built at the site of the plane crash, recognizing the 3 performers killed on that night in 1959. 6 years later, in 1995, a Japanese engineer named Saburo Ishigami watched The Buddy Holly Story and became obsessed with Buddy Holly and his music. In 1997, Ishigami began building a time machine for the purpose of traveling back to 1959 and preventing the death of Buddy Holly so that the musician could continue to make music for everyone to love. After several failed attempts, Ishigami finally developed a working prototype of his time machine in 2004. He packed the blueprints for his machine and traveled by plane to Los Angeles, California. It was there, at a used bookstore, that he purchased a book called The Death of James Dean by Warren Beath, which he read as he traveled by train to Mason City, Iowa. There, in a secluded cornfield, Saburo Ishigami painstakingly constructed his time machine from materials purchased at a nearby Home Depot. Then, on August 23, 2004, the Japanese engineer traveled back in time to the evening of Groundhog's Day, 1959, to stop Buddy Holly from getting on that plane. Sure enough, Ishigami found Buddy Holly. He asked the musician to sign an autograph for him, which he did, and then he told him not to get on that plane. But Buddy Holly had trouble understanding the Japanese engineer's thick accent, and he walked away. With no time to spare, Ishigami hit Buddy Holly in the head with a piece of metal pipe that he'd purchased at Home Depot, knocking him out. He dragged him away to the cornfield where he'd arrived earlier in his time machine. Ritchie Valens and the Big Fat Bopper, unable to find Buddy Holly, got on the plane to fly to the Winter Dance Party. They crashed and died. They crashed and died! Someone noticed Buddy Holly was missing and called the cops, who went looking for him. Ishigami heard the sirens and saw the flashing lights approaching the field of corn. He got in his time machine and returned to August 23, 2004, leaving Buddy Holly unconscious in the corn. When the police found Buddy Holly, he had a cracked skull and permanent brain damage, but he would live and keep making music. Now back in his own time, Ishigami traveled to a nearby record store to find out what his favorite musician had come up with in the past few decades. The Japanese engineer found some new Buddy Holly records, and he listened to them, but he did not like what he heard.
I was walking on the ground, I didn't make a sound, then I turned around and I saw a clown. Had a frown, stood on a mound, started barking like a hound.
frantically listened to all of the songs, becoming increasingly hopeless with each new one he heard.
I brushed my teeth, the sink was dirty underneath. I could smell it, you could tell.
He hated all of it. All the years he'd spent on his time machine were wasted. Depressed, he purchased a bottle of schnapps at a nearby liquor store. He also bought a carving knife. He sat in the cornfield and got drunk on schnapps, preparing to perform ritual suicide with the knife he'd bought. But then, as he looked up at the stars, he got an idea. Ishigami got back in his time machine and traveled back in time to 1955. He walked to the highway and stole a car, threatening the driver with his big knife. Then he drove to Sherman Oaks, California. On September 30th, 1955, Saburo Ishigami arrived at the Mobil gas station on Ventura Boulevard. He parked his car and he waited. He knew James Dean would be there on his way to the weekend sports car races in Salinas, California. He knew James Dean would never make it to the races. He knew he would crash and die. He knew he could stop it. Sure enough, James Dean pulled into the gas station with his entourage at about 2 p.m. The Japanese engineer approached him. He told him not to go to the races, but James Dean had trouble understanding Ishigami because of his accent. So Ishigami did the only thing he could do. He took out his big knife and he plunged it into the tire of James Dean's brand new Porsche. He stabbed the tire again and again, shredding the rubber. He knew James Dean would be angry with him, but he didn't care because he knew he was saving James Dean's life. He knew he would go down in history as the man who prevented the death of James Dean. James Dean and his friends tried to stop Ishigami, but he ran away before they could grab him. He jumped in his car and drove back to Iowa, laughing all the way. James Dean had to get his tire fixed, and as a result, he did not die that day. Saburo Ishigami had saved the young movie star's life, but he was never able to prove it, and nobody ever believed him.